Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kevin Moss, and I'm a policy advisor here at the Western Governors Association. Welcome to today's webinar on broadband data and mapping. This webinar is being held as part of North Dakota Governor Burgum's Reimagining the Rural West initiative. The initiative will examine challenges and opportunities in rural economic and community development with the goal of recommending policy changes and best practices to support vibrant and enduring rural communities in the West. The initiative will use regional workshops and policy-centric webinars to examine challenges and opportunities in the rural West. We have already hosted 2 regional workshops in Fargo, North Dakota, and Santa Fe, New Mexico, and have upcoming workshops scheduled in Idaho and Oregon on December 3rd and March 19th and 20th, respectively. If you would like more information about these workshops, please visit our website or reach out to me at kmoss@westgov.org. A key pillar of Governor Burgum's initiative is connectivity for rural communities. Digital connectivity and high-speed broadband are the critical infrastructure of the 21st century, supporting economic development, distance learning, and telehealth applications across the country. This initiative will identify strategies and policy opportunities to accelerate the deployment of broadband to rural areas. A necessary element of supporting broadband deployment to rural communities is knowing where broadband coverage currently is and is not. Today's speakers from the Federal Communications Commission, National Telecommunications and Information Administration, and House and Senate Commerce Committees are going to update us on their respective efforts to improve federal broadband data and mapping systems. To begin the conversation, each speaker will discuss how their respective agency or committee is addressing this challenge. We will then move to a moderated discussion led by Brent Legg, Vice President of Government Affairs for Connected Nation. Brent is also going to reserve some time to answer questions from the audience. To send in questions, please use the chat box function on the left side of your screen and address them to me, Kevin Moss. You may send questions in at any point, and I will pass them over to Brent for his use in leading the discussion. I would also like to thank our generous sponsors, some of whom are listed on the title slide and a few of whom are listening in today. We really appreciate your support. Thank you again for tuning in, and at this point, I'll turn it over to Brent to introduce our panelists and get us started.
Thank you, Kevin. Again, my name is Brent Legg. I'm Vice President of Government Affairs for nonprofit Connected Nation. Quality broadband data and mapping have become foundational to good broadband policymaking. And particularly over the last year, we have seen broad bipartisan agreement that the National Broadband Map and the data used to inform it, what is known as Form 477 data, need to improve significantly to better support state, federal, and private efforts to close the digital divide. This year, there have been a number of very positive actions taken by Congress, the FCC and NTIA to support the creation of a much more accurate and granular national broadband map. And that is the subject of today's webinar. Today, we're joined by a distinguished group of panelists who are key influencers that are making these policy developments happen. We're joined today by Kirk Burgee, Chief of Staff to the Wireline Competition Bureau at the Federal Communications Commission, Jerry Leverich, who is Senior Counsel to the U.S. House of Representatives Energy and Commerce Committee, John Lynn, who is Professional Staff to the U.S. Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, and Tim Moyer, who is Program Manager for the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. I want to thank WGA today for hosting the event, and I'm looking forward to a robust discussion. I'll now turn it over to the panelists, who will begin with opening presentations. And as Kevin mentioned, we'll move to Q&A after that point. We'll start with Kirk Bergy from the FCC. Kirk?
Thank you, Brett. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk to you today about our efforts here at the FCC. I'll just start with the deck at the second slide, I guess, after the cover. So as Brett mentioned, the FCC's current broadband deployment collection is known as the FCC Form 477. This was initiated in 2000 by an order issued in that year, and originally, as it was created, it collected voice and broadband subscriber data from facilities-based providers, that is all facilities-based providers of service to end users. In 2013, the FCC revised the Form 477 data collection to, for the first time, collect deployment information, and that's the current framework for the Form 477 as relates to deployment, and that it is reported by providers on the basis of census blocks, and it is a binary matter. Providers report whether they have or could serve broadband in a given census block, so it's a yes or no, and that's what we've recognized is what needed to be looked at and to improved upon. Although it did provide us with valuable information that we didn't have before, we have recognized that we need to go further to further improve the deployment collection. So that takes us to slide 3, which is the Digital Opportunity Data Collection, which was established by an FCC order in August of this year. And once it's up and operational, it will be a new fixed broadband deployment data collection, initially fixed, and I'll talk a bit about that later on. But and it will be a separate collection from the Form 477, which continues to exist and will be in effect at least for the time being. Under the Digital Opportunity Data Collection, fixed broadband service providers will submit geospatial maps that encompass the locations at which they can or which they could provide broadband service. So that's sort of the key difference in terms of what the DODC would do as compared to the Form 477. Rather than just a binary determination on a census block basis, providers will in fact have to provide the Commission with specific maps that are in the form of shapefiles depicting the areas over which they do or can provide service within 10 business days of a request. This is a much more specific way of reporting information, and we think it will be a big improvement over what we're currently doing with Form 477. The filers will report the speeds that are actually available in each shapefile that they submit. If different speeds are available in different places, they'll have to file separate shapefiles for each speed that's available. Another key aspect of the DODC is that it will be administered by the Universal Service Administrative Company, which currently administers the FCC's Universal Service program, subject to our close oversight. A lot of in the report, or a lot of the elements of the day-to-day operation of the DODC will be administered by USAC as we refer to it. So that takes us to the fourth slide. The DODC will also include a crowdsourcing component, which is not the case now with the Form 477. And as contemplated, there will be a platform through which state, local, and tribal governmental entities, as well as members of the public, will be able to submit information about the data that's submitted by the providers, which will leverage the experience that those entities have in terms of what's actually going on the ground. And it's essentially they will be able to say, in response to what's depicted on the data that we retrieve through the DODC, that it's not accurate, and essentially initiating a process that will be developed at a later point that will require providers to respond to submissions asserting that the file data was not correct in the first instance. In addition to that aspect of the collection, USAC is required under the order to submit a plan to the Commission for independently verifying the fixed broadband coverage polygons that are filed with the DODC. In other words, they'll be quality checked aside from the crowdsourcing component, which will be a big part of the collection, but there will also be an independent verification to make sure that the data are internally consistent, that they are make sense in terms of geographically and other aspects of the data. So that takes us to slide 5. Another key aspect of the DODC in the report and order, the Commission stated its intention to develop a nationwide broadband location database, sometimes referred to as a location fabric database. And what this would do is combine data from multiple sources such as address databases, satellite imagery, and land parcel records, combining those data sources into one source that is intended to develop an understanding of where every location that could receive broadband nationwide is, and to establish sort of a very specific understanding of where broadband can be deployed. So once that is created, it would be overlaid with the DODC shapefile data, so that the shapefiles that are submitted by the providers would, with that layer of data, reflect the actual locations within those shapefiles, and that would provide a maximal level of granularity in terms of deployment, and it would be a further refinement of the database that would enable us to see, which specific locations actually are being reported as served, and which specific locations are actually outside of areas reported as served. So that takes us to slide 6, which this sets out the timing for the initial filing, and this again, it's at the order in August established the DODC for fixed service providers. I'll talk a bit about the mobile element a little bit later on, but once the FCC has provided public notice that the collection platform is ready, there will be a 6-month period for all providers to make an initial filing of their deployment data. And then once they've done that, they will have on a rolling basis, when they make changes that affect their networks, they'll have 6 months to update that initial filing, and then the subsequent filings, it'll be a 6-month cycle every time there's a change to the network, that data that they've reported previously. And then each year, on or before June 30, every provider must certify to the accuracy of the data as of 6 months prior. That is, as of December 31st of the prior year. And in this way, we capture providers who don't report modifications on that 6-month cycle, even if they haven't made any changes. They have to come back to us on or before June 30, certifying that as of December 31 of the prior year, their data is accurate. So that takes us to slide number 7. Accompanying the report and order was a further notice of proposed rulemaking that asked asked for comment on a number of issues relating to the DODC and to the crowdsource platform, and also on with regard to the location data fabric. Among the questions that are raised, the Commission is asked whether it should prescribe technical standards for the fixed deployment filings in the DODC. In other words, should the FCC prescribe how filers report where service can be offered? Among the issues on which comment was sought are whether we should prescribe, for example, a buffer where in connection with network equipment. In other words, if there's a certain type of network infrastructure, should we say that a provider would report services being deployed within a certain distance from that particular type of equipment? Also, with regard to the crowdsourced data platform, the Commission asked for comment on a number of issues about how to deal with the information that we get from the public and how to track and resolve disputes. The platform does contemplate that there will be a process for disputes through which the providers will have an opportunity to provide responsive information, and with the ultimate goal of actually resolving the dispute. Whether if it means that there in fact isn't coverage where it was initially reported, then we would be looking for a correction, or if in fact there is coverage, then we would be looking to resolve that with regard to the party filing the dispute. The Commission also asked for comment on what type of data should be collected. In other words, when someone does make a report of in the crowdsourced platform, what information specifically should they provide to us to enable us to make the most efficient resolution of that? And then also related to that is what's the time frame within this process that should apply? How long should providers have to provide their information, and how long should it take? How long should be accorded to actually resolve the dispute? Also, going to slide number 8, as I mentioned, there are questions asked about how to manage the location fabric database. One of the primary questions is what data sources should be used. I mentioned a number of options that have been used. There has been a pilot of such a database conducted by U.S. Telecom, and they use things like satellite imagery and tax records and address databases. We ask, which of those and what others might be appropriate to use in the event that the FCC develops this type of a database. How should serviceable locations be defined? In other words, what should be the unit that is being reported? And this comes up in connection, particularly in rural areas. There can be issues with multiple buildings on a single parcel. May or may not be appropriate for each of them to be defined as a serviceable location. And the similar issue comes up in connection with multi-tenant buildings. Is the single building with multiple tenants one serviceable location, or should each of the units within the building be considered to be a serviceable location? And then finally, we ask for comment on issues relating to quality assurance. How do we make sure that the data is in fact depicting what it purports to depict? Should we conduct sampling or use other methodologies to make sure that that's the case? And some additional issues raised in the further notice. The further notice proposes incorporating the mobile voice and broadband deployment data into the DODC that's currently collected on Form 477. In the August order, the Commission determined that we would in fact move forward with fixed deployment data in the DODC. The further notice asks, would it be appropriate to also to roll in mobile voice and deployment data? And in conjunction with that, the further notice asks for comment on steps that the FCC could take to improve the quality of mobile deployment data, asking about things like technical specifications that could be applied to ensure that the data were accurate, the mobile deployment data. And then the final issue in the further notice is whether at some point we should sunset the Form 477 deployment collection. As indicated, it is ongoing and will be for the foreseeable future. Once the DODC is up and operational, we would be looking at whether or not we need to discontinue that aspect of the Form 477 deployment collection. Note that the Form 477 does many things in addition to deployment, so it's not a proposal to eliminate the Form 477 altogether, but rather just to explore whether we should discontinue that specific element of it. And then the final slide, so we have finished our comment and reply cycle on the further notice. As of October 7th, reply comments came in. We received 113 submissions approximately, and got a very good record, which we're currently looking through and working very hard to move forward on the DODC. And that concludes my slides.
Thank you very much, Kirk. And just a reminder to the audience, there is a chat function where you can submit questions for the panelists. As soon as the presentations are completed, at the end, we will move to Q&A. We have several questions that Kevin and I have prepared for the discussion, and then we'll also be taking the audience questions as well. So next, we'll move to Tim Moyer from NTIA. Tim?
Excellent. Thank you for having me here today on this panel. I'll lead off by stating that my contributions are going to be based off of my professional opinion, based on my experience at NTIA. And so we'll look at our first slide here. So a little bit of background about NTIA. So we're, by law, we're responsible to advise the Office of the President on all things telecommunication and information policy. Broadband USA is the organization I work in. We're responsible for expanding broadband access and adoption, but you're probably familiar with NTIA from a spectrum perspective also, and we do a lot of work behind the scenes on research and engineering for telecommunication policy. At Broadband USA, our goal is to educate, convene, and assist. Our reason for being is our fundamental goal is to improve access to local communities on the broadband infrastructure side and to help to support meaningful use. And so we do a lot of webinars and publications. We work behind the scene in partnerships. A good example of that, actually, my colleague Karen Hansen pointed out to me that Kirk, who just spoke, works with NTIA on the American Broadband Initiative on a number of work streams, from federal funding to data and mapping, which is a great example of interagency work that we find very, very important. And then technical assistance, we actually work directly with local communities. And at the end, you'll see a link to our website. We work with local offices to help them review strategic plans and do all sorts of assistance there that we find valuable. Over the last 3 years, we've engaged with over 400 communities to help them with their either digital inclusion or infrastructure needs. So that leads us to where we are now with mapping. And so back in March 2018, we added mapping back into our portfolio. For folks that remember the old SBI program, originally along with BTOP, the Broadband Technology Opportunities Program, where we funded middle mile. We also managed close to a $300 million grant program where we stood up grant offices across the country. They did data collection, key point data validation, and helped to provide that comparison to map out the broadband availability. That program was sunsetted, and now we're coming back to it now. So in March of 2018, Congress directed us initially with $7.5 million. The good news is that we've been getting rolling funding, so this is a multi-year effort. When we first saw $7.5 million and our last experience was $300 million, the first thing we had to do was scale back expectations, so we led with a pilot. We have 8 states that we're working with right now, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But the key drivers of this program is that we're to collaborate with the FCC. We're to work with our existing relationships with states, leveraging existing data. This is not a new, there's no funding to go collect new data, but the key thing is I'm allowed to buy data, and we'll get into that a little bit more also, but I can buy commercial data, but we're leveraging existing data, and this is not a duplication effort. We're not here to change or adapt the 477 process. This is a standalone effort. And the whole goal here is to help federal agencies and states make better decisions when it comes to broadband policy and broadband funding. So I alluded to 8 states. So when we launched this multi-year program, we knew that we didn't have the funding or the capacity to launch nationwide right out of the gate. A lot of that is because most of the states aren't ready they didn't have the data. And so leveraging our state broadband leaders network, we have a fairly robust group of folks that stayed engaged post-SBI that are in this space and were champions for their states. So that was a great starting point. And working with them, we were able to identify California, Utah, Maine, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Tennessee, North Carolina, West Virginia. I hope I got them all. And what's interesting about those states is that they all had some form of either mapping program or data collection. Some folks continued the SBI data collection effort. Other folks, very interestingly, had grant programs that were able to get sub-census block data directly from service providers. Other folks, we've already talked a little bit about crowdsourcing, but other folks have done their own crowdsourcing efforts, which were very informative. And so we were able to launch with the 8 states back on September 30th with our beta release. And we're moving forward with outreach to continue to add more. We'll go to the next slide here. We also coordinate with states for input. When we were standing up the program, we did a request for comment, which we found very informative. We got feedback from over 50 organizations across government, broadband industry, not-for-profits. We basically wanted to get a lay of the land of broadband availability, both on the data side and the policy side. And so if we look at our next slide here, we'll see some of the feedback we got. Sub-census level reporting was a common theme we got across the board. Mobile wireless, data validation was key. Speed test data, crowdsourced data, and getting data from carriers. Those were all themes that we heard and shaped the planning when we stood up this organization. And so next I'll move to our deployment model. So we call it the NBAM, the National Broadband Availability Map, but it's more than a map for us. It's a GIS platform, and we view this as a tool for the visualization and comparison of multiple data sets, federal, state, and commercially available. So what's key for us is that we think that this tool is going to enable us to identify areas of insufficient service. We're going to compare multiple data sets, looking to identify some of the discrepancies in availability, either folks that are considered served that may be unserved or underserved. And then while we're not there yet, we're going to get to the point where we can produce reports and analysis that will help drive and inform better policy planning and investment decision making. The key thing about this tool is that it's a policy tool, so it's a private tool. It's a tool directly for our federal users and states. So it's not a public-facing tool. And the key there is that we actually have some public and private data that make that very important. We think that the combination of the federal, state, and commercial data sets is a unique differentiator for us. This dynamic GIS platform is going to be very, very helpful for our user base. We've partnered with ESRI, and folks here at the Western Governors Association, I think, are familiar with ESRI. So we're working with them. We wanted to make sure, when we looked at the original SBI program, we invested in servers and built all this stuff out. We didn't want to go down that path again. We wanted to have scalability. And so we went cloud. Everything's cloud these days. And so ESRI was able to offer us a one-stop shop solution where we had their entire suite of products at our service in the cloud. For folks that are familiar with IT security and government, it was already FedRamped, which gave us a quicker path to deployment, which was key because I can tell you firsthand, as the person who marshaled this through IT security, it's not something I want to do all the time. It's a very challenging process, so that was very helpful for us. But you'll see a snapshot here of how we are going to bring data in. We're going to leverage the services that ESRI has. We're going to bring in capabilities on the application side and APIs and provide a robust environment for state users and federal users to not only visualize as a map, but then also to break down this data and do some really cool analytics. We're just starting to scratch the surface if folks are familiar with the concept of business intelligence tools. We're very excited about taking these visualizations and bringing that data to life in multiple ways, infographics, things like that. So where we've been and where we're going. So we launched on 9/30. We have our 8 states that have access to the platform. We have a variety of data in the tool already. So on the FCC side, we leverage the 477 data. We have hub data in there. We have CAF data in there. So we have data about federally funded programs, and we also have data about eligibility. On the census side, we were able to leverage some of the American Community Survey data from Census, which is very informative when you think about ways to see how the population in an area then can drive things. USDA, we're working with them. They have I'm sure everybody's familiar with the $600 million Reconnect program. So we have all of their Reconnect eligibility data in there, which we think will be informative. And then even on the Treasury side, we have some of their tax program information in there that can be informative. Commercial data, we already have MLab speed test data. And we are in the process of ingesting UCLA speed test data into our portal also, which we think will be interesting. So you think about what we're doing right now in fiscal year 20. Actually, today we just launched an update with the latest FCC 477 data. Timing was a little bit off there, so when the FCC released their latest data in September, we were getting ready to launch our tool, and so we didn't have time to pivot. So we're getting that in. We're working on usability enhancements. So when we look at the initial 8 states, we're getting feedback directly from them about how they want to use this tool. And so that's why we capture this as a beta release. We kind of have the building blocks of the tool, and now we're going to enhance that tool to meet specific needs of our users. We also really want to focus on our federal users from an investment decision perspective, and so we're working with our federal partners to identify what the criterion are for their programs, so that we can create tools that can help them better evaluate the programs, and how we can help our own technical assistance teams better serve the communities. When we look at new federal data sets we want to bring in, mobile is on our radar also. We have access to the FCC 477 mobile data. We want to bring that in. We want to bring it in along with our UCLA data. So we purchased both fixed and mobile UCLA data, which we think is going to be informative. And so we're going through the strategy right now on the system architecture about how we bring that data in for comparison. On the commercial side, I've mentioned UCLA a couple of times. We also are looking at broadband infrastructure data. We think that'll be very informative. Not only knowing where networks are, some of the data we gather from states are like state-funded networks, which is helpful, but there are commercial vendors out there that know where all the fiber is located, know where the points of presence are, and things like that can be helpful on a planning side. One of our challenges is licensing that, though, so that's our next challenge about how we can acquire that data. We're very focused on education and healthcare. When we think back to our BTOP days, if folks are familiar, we not only deployed middle mile, but we also funded the deployment of community anchor institutions like K-12 schools, not actually building the schools, but the connectivity to those schools, getting connectivity to hospitals and to support telehealth and things like that. We think those are great economic drivers for areas. And then we know that we need to stand up customer support, because I don't want folks calling me when they have issues with the tool. I've mentioned business intelligence. We think that's a very exciting opportunity to bring this data to life and really bring the analytics. And then we continue our outreach to new states to bring them in, and federal partners. And as we go out into the out years, we just look to continue to bring more data and more capabilities. And that takes me to my last slide here, which is an overview of some of the resources we have to offer. On the technical assistance side, if you're interested in broadband and this is not a space that you're that familiar with, we have a lot of resources, how-to guides that are very informative, written almost like a broadband 101 concept to help folks get up to speed, which are useful. We have our technical assistance team, so if your communities have specific needs for their communities, we can help. And we also have a webinar series where we have a variety of topics month to month. And with that, I'll turn it back over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. And next we'll move to John Lynn, who is professional staff for Chairman Roger Wicker with the U.S. Senate Commerce Committee. John?
Yep, thanks so much, Brent. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you for having me. Broadband mapping, broadband data have been a top priority for Chairman Wicker and the entire Senate Commerce Committee. A lot of this stems from the current state of the maps, which, as many of you know, unfortunately overstate coverage, and because of the funding that is available to all states, because as a result of the funding programs. Given this interest, Chairman Wicker has introduced a number of bills related to both broadband mapping, broadband data, and interagency coordination. The first is the Broadband Data Act, which is S 1822. This bill would require more granular and precise information collection and use of that more granular data to create maps that different federal agencies would be required to use when making funding decisions for broadband deployment. On the fixed side, we take a a lot of the ideas the industry has proposed. First, we require the creation of the broadband serviceable locations fabric that U.S. Telecom has proposed. We require the FCC to use that as the baseline and then allow providers to report where they provide coverage using shapefiles or a list of addresses, with providers not being required to provide addresses if they don't want to. In addition to using data provided by providers, we also allow states who do their own broadband mapping to contribute data that can be used to inform the data collection and inform the maps that result from that process. We also allow entities such as UCLA who would like to submit their own data that they collect to submit data as well. The FCC is not required to use the data that comes from third-party entities, but if it finds it's in public interest to do so, it may integrate that data into its collection. On the mobile side, we would require the FCC to set precise standards as to the mobile broadband availability data that's collected. And the standards that we prescribe in the bill are designed to be more stringent than the standards that the FCC used in the Mobility Fund 2 information collection that occurred in 2017-2018. That data, the standards that the FCC used in that information collection were unfortunately grossly overstated coverage to the point where, in Senator Booker's home state of Mississippi, they said that 98% of the state had mobile coverage. So to address that, to address that problem, which we attribute to standards that were weak, we asked the FCC to set higher standards. Here we require them to seek data from providers where they can provide 5.1 mobile service with a 50% cell loading factor and a 90% cell edge probability. Those are what we've been told to be industry standards. Obviously, a little more technical than we generally prefer to put in legislation, but given how the Mobility Fund 2 went, we felt that it was necessary to include to actually prescribe standards. In addition to more granular and precise collection standards, we also the Data Act also requires the FCC to establish a challenge process where consumers, other entities, and important to this group, state and local governments can challenge data that is submitted by providers and the subsequent maps that result from that data collection. The FCC would be required to make this challenge process user-friendly, integrating lessons learned from previous challenge processes to make sure that it's not burdensome, either financially or administratively, on people who are trying to submit challenges. We also asked the FCC to create a crowdsourcing tool to allow the public to, on an ongoing basis, to submit data to make the maps to verify and inform the data that's collected in the maps as well. So that's the Broadband Data Act. Here in the Senate, it has passed committee, and it currently has 67 bipartisan co-sponsors. We're very proud that we are now veto-proof. And we are in the process of negotiating differences from with the House version, which I'll let Jerry discuss during his portion. Another bill that Senator Wicker has introduced and is proud of is the Broadband Interagency Coordination Act, which is S-1294. And this bill would require the FCC, the Department of Agriculture, and NTIA to enter into an agreement that they will share information about broadband funding projects, and that they will use common data and common maps to ensure that they're not duplicating funding for projects and overbuilding on each other. This bill is a bipartisan bill. The lead co-sponsor is Senator Klobuchar, and it has already passed the Senate Commerce Committee and is on its way to consideration on the Senate floor. So those are the two major bills that the Senate Commerce Committee has worked on, and we are looking forward to addressing the problem of the problems that with the current broadband data collections and mapping efforts.
Thank you very much, John. And next we'll move to Jerry Leverich, who is Senior Counsel to Congressman Mike Doyle, the Chairman of the Communications and Technology Subcommittee of House Energy and Commerce. Jerry?
Thanks, Brent, and appreciate you guys having me. Just to clarify, I'm Senior Counsel to Chairman Frank Colonna, the full Committee on Energy and Commerce, but obviously work very closely with Chairman Doyle and his staff as well. Just to ping off of some of the things John said, I think members of the Energy and Commerce Committee have been very, very motivated to make sure that they are taking the measures that they can to build out broadband in rural, urban, and suburban areas where it doesn't exist, but rural has been a particular focus. As part of that, the committee earlier this year introduced the Lift America Act, which creates a $40 billion reverse auction program. That number is estimated by the FCC to reach 98% of the U.S. population with high-speed broadband access. But as part of that endeavor, and in order to make it work in the most sustainable and efficient way, it's really key that we have accurate broadband maps so that we aren't, one, building on top of networks that exist, and two, targeting funding at the places where we know broadband isn't there. So with that, we have a few measures that we've taken up here in the House that are moving through our committee or have either already passed the House that relate to broadband data. One is the companion bill to the bill that John spoke about, the Broadband Data Act. There are a few noteworthy changes that exist on the House side that I think are worth just mentioning. One is a key driver in both bills is the creation of a broadband serviceable location fabric. And just to clarify precisely what we're talking about when we describe a broadband serviceable location fabric, imagine it's the map of every place in the country that could or could not have broadband, that's capable of having broadband. And so getting that right is key to everything else. Once we have that map, we can say when a carrier provides a polygon or a shapefile about where they could serve, if you overlay that on top of the fabric, then you have a list of addresses that could and could not have broadband. So we created an authorization, $25 million for the first year, $9 million each year through 2028 to make sure that we are producing that fabric and the underlying data that's laid on top of it in an open and transparent way. The reason we do that is one of the key things. It's slightly more expensive to make sure that the data is public and open, but so many of the important discoveries we've had with regard to the inaccuracy of the Form 477 data have come because of academics, researchers, and frankly, just average people who are driving around their homes or studying a certain area and say, there's no broadband here, and then when they look at the publicly available maps, they can see that that's not in accordance with what the FCC is reporting. The other things that I think are noteworthy, we also include provisions to rope in other federal agencies that may have expertise in testing where broadband is and isn't, like the Postal Service, for example, or the Census Bureau, to have them help to the extent practicable with ensuring that the data that the FCC is collecting and putting in its maps is accurate. And then finally, we include metrics to be reported in the maps related to quality of service. So there we're talking about both speeds and latency so that we don't just have the binary number of what is and isn't broadband, but we can see something more specific in that. So we can see, okay, well, it's 10.1 here, it's 25.3 there, it's 100 at this location. The latency is 5 milliseconds here, and it's satellite service in this other place with substantially higher latency. Beyond that, we also have another bill, the MAPS Act, the Mapping Accuracy Promotes Services Act. It's relatively simple and only says that the FCC, or that a carrier who knowingly or recklessly submits inaccurate data to the FCC regarding broadband deployment has committed an unlawful act. This stems out of an incident that happened earlier this year where at least one provider was reporting to the FCC that it could serve huge swaths of the country when in fact it was a reseller of others' service. The final bill I want to mention before I close out, is just the Access Broadband Act. It's the bill that passed the House earlier this year. It would codify the program that we all heard about a little earlier, Broadband USA, which is an excellent program. A number of our members here on the committee are huge champions of the work they do over at Broadband USA. So it would codify the technical assistance work they do, but also expand their role to help them better coordinate broadband deployment across the federal government, including by collecting data from programs that support broadband deployment. So, for example, the USDA Reconnect program would be included in that, and also the FCC's universal service programs. So it's an important measure. The House has passed it last Congress, again this Congress. The other two bills I mentioned have been moving through our committee. They were just favorably reported by the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology yesterday afternoon. We've been working very closely with our Senate counterparts on the Commerce Committee, and I think we're all very optimistic that we will be able to have a new broadband data law sometime this Congress. And with that, I'll give it back to Brent.
Thank you very much, Jerry, and my apologies for neglecting to mention your promotion there to the full committee senior counsel role, so thank you for correcting me on that. My first question is going to be for you and John, and this is connected, I think, to your comments there at the very end of your presentation. There does seem to be broad bipartisan support on legislation to finally fix the national broadband map. Why do you think that is the case? And I guess the second part of that question is, because there is so much bipartisan support, is the legislation something that can actually get done in the near term, despite what is oftentimes a challenging political environment on the Hill?
Yeah, so I guess if you remind you, I'll take the first stab at this. I think one reason why this is such a big priority is that every state has unserved areas, and it's so important that we bridge that it's so important to every member of Congress that we bridge the digital divide. And with so much money that's at stake through the various funding programs from the different agencies, it's important that we get the best data and the best maps available to make those decisions. So I think that just given this priority and the importance of broadband, it's an easy thing for members of both parties to get behind. I think that just given that urge, that's exactly why it's you have such bipartisan support for this for the bills, and so I think that is very likely. If I could predict, I'd hope to say by the end of the year for us to get these bills across the finish line, so that we can have better maps as soon as possible.
Yeah, so I'll just jump in there and add a little bit to what John said. I think he's absolutely right. This is an issue that members have cared about on our side for quite some time. I think, it comes down to something that's just easily understandable for folks back home to say, well, this agency is saying that we have broadband access, and it just isn't true here. So I think as part of the Ray Bonds Act that passed in 2018, the Congress required the FCC to improve some of the maps relating to mobile broadband after the Mobility Fund Phase 2 auction concluded. That auction actually hasn't concluded because of issues with the map and the FCC's ongoing investigation of several carriers that it has reason to believe, or has publicly stated it has reason to believe, may have violated the Commission's rules with regard to submitting accurate data. And I think in the wake of that, members have continued to press, say nothing has gotten better. We passed the law in 2018, nothing's gotten better. We've got to take a very serious look at everything we can possibly do to improve this problem. And I think the end result of that is what John's boss and some of my bosses have been working on this year. And to agree with him one more time, I think it is very possible that we'll have something by the end of the year, certainly by the end of this Congress. And we're working diligently to make sure that happens because, as I said before, it's such an important issue, not because the maps are important for their own sake, although they are, but because the maps are an integral part of any broadband deployment infrastructure program. And that's really what we're talking about here, is making sure that we have the right maps so that we can connect every American in the country.
Thanks, gentlemen. We had a question come in from the audience asking for those bill numbers again. the primary bill numbers for mapping in Congress. So that is S 1822 on the Senate side and HR 4229 on the House side. And then HR 4227 is a much smaller bill. That's sort of a companion bill to HR 4229, and that deals again with penalties for intentional misreporting from service providers. So check those out, and we'll move on now to the next question for Kirk. Kirk, as the FCC and USAC prepare to implement the digital opportunity data collection, do you have a sense for what the timeline will be? I know that the Commission is also going to be considering the possibility of a second order to clarify some issues that were still outstanding from the first report and order. Can you talk just a little bit about what that timeline looks like? And you may not be able to provide specifics, but I think it would be useful to the states to get a better understanding of how long it's going to potentially take us to get to a new national broadband map.
Yep, sure. So we are working very hard to implement the aspects of the order that have been passed. The order did establish the collection and a number of elements associated with it, and we're moving ahead to implement that. There are issues that are open that will be addressed in at least one upcoming order, and we're also at the same time working on that. We have our record, which closed, as I mentioned, early last month, and we're looking hard at that to try to get those open issues resolved as quickly as we can. I don't have a specific time frame, but I can tell you it's something that's very important to the agency and to the chairman, and we're putting a lot of effort into it to get it done as quickly as we can.
All right. Thank you very much, Kirk. Next question is for Tim at NTIA. How do you view the broadband data being collected from states impacting the data that the FCC plans to collect under its new DODC mapping program? And how will the program that NTIA is administering right now impact the DODC in some way? Tim?
Great question. So from our perspective, states are a key part of the discussion, really reinforces the value of the state broadband leaders, the SPLN network that I mentioned before. I think it's also important to note that so the FCC has a public-facing map, which is fixed broadband deployment. Our map is a map for policymakers. They're different. They have different audiences. The FCC map designed to showcase their fixed deployment data they gather from 477. Our map is going to take that same data, other state data, other federal data, commercial data, and bring it all together for comparison and analysis that we think is going to be helpful for policy making and decision making. So the key from a DODC perspective is that any changes that the FCC ends up adopting, we're going to then ingest that new data into our tool. We're going to adapt our tool to handle any formatting changes, any data differences, and then continue to use that as a layer against all the other data sets. And so it's a complementary effort. We don't view it as an either or. FCC data is a key data set that we want to bring in, but it's one of many data sets that we think are informative. It's the combination of these data sets that I think is the key differentiator.
Okay, thank you, Tim. We've got another question that has come in from the audience from the state of Colorado. What will be the estimated lag time between provider-reported DODC data and the release of that data for policymakers to consume? And a comment was made about how Form 477 data currently is 18 months old, and that is a challenge for states that are currently funding broadband deployment for service gaps in their state, and that timely and accurate data is essential to combine state and federal broadband funding efforts. And certainly we at Connected Nation agree with that wholeheartedly. So I don't know who wants to take that question, probably best suited for Kirk, I would imagine, from the FCC. Is there any estimation that you can give us on how quickly the data, once collected, would be would be consumable by the public?
Well, no, nothing specific. We're dealing with a new collection, which involves a lot of new elements and things that we're going to have to manage for the first time. So, however, it's a great question, and we're very aware of that issue with the time lag. And so our goal is to improve that lag between filing and submission with this. There are aspects of the DODC that should help facilitate that. The fact that it's not that filers are required to report on a rolling basis as modifications to their systems occur will mean that we get a more continuous flow of data in, depending on the circumstances in the networks themselves. But we do a certain amount of right now the Form 477 is a twice annual collection, so that means we get lots of information all at once twice a year, and we do a certain amount of quality assurance and review of that data before releasing it. Under the new collection, I would expect that we would be getting a more even flow across the calendar year, and although there is the certification that we'll be getting in June for the prior December, I think in a lot of cases that won't involve getting new information. It'll just be confirmation that what we already had was correct. So I think that is a factor that will help us move the data through more quickly. But at the same, in addition to that, we're very aware of that issue and are looking with this new collection to move the data out as fast as we can. I would note that in the item that was adopted in August, the Commission indicated that it anticipated making the challenge data available as soon as possible and in a fairly quick turnaround in terms of what is submitted, that should become publicly available very quickly. That's a challenge to the deployment data, so that doesn't answer that question. But it does, I think, evidence an intention to try to make this data much more current as it's released to the public.
So this is Tim from NTIA. I'll piggyback on that, and it kind of ties back to the first question about states, but also opens up to commercial. One of the things, again, that's a unique differentiator for us is bringing in these a variety of data sets. When we talk about the UCLA data, we have UCLA data as of now, and so we can bring in sub-census block data when we bring that. Once we finish our system, our data discovery, and bring that into the tool. In the next month or two, we'll have that sub-census block visibility. We have states that have their own grant programs, and so through that grant, they can get provider information at a sub-census block level, so that's more current. Tennessee's actually using the tool right now to help them make decisions for their Round 3 grant. So as we get current sub-census level data from states or commercial vendors that then we can use as a comparative layer against 477 data or other data sets, we think that helps us be more current and give a better sense of what the true lay of the land is.
All right, thank you, Kirk and Tim, for those responses. The next question is going to be for Jerry and John. The FCC certainly seems like it's moving very quickly forward on implementing its DODC program, which seems to do several of the things that are contemplated in the legislation that's been filed in the House and the Senate. What are some of the key differences between the DODC program and the requirements in the legislation, and how are they similar?
Hey, so this is Jerry. I can start, and then John, feel free to jump in, obviously. So I think the places where they are most similar is with regard to modifying the data collection process at the FCC so that it focuses on the submission of shape files or shape polygons rather than
Did we lose Jerry?
Hey, Jerry, this is Kevin. I think
we may have lost. Go ahead.
Yeah, Jerry, maybe just try unmuting or calling back in if you're having any audio troubles.
I can
John can jump in.
Yeah, I can jump in. So just to jump off what Jerry said, yeah, the biggest similarities is on the fixed side, where we shift from census block reporting to shapefile reporting by providers. We also the bill and the data collection also are similar in the sense that they both include a crowdsourcing requirement that the FCC I guess the data collection uses USAC. We require the FCC to allow for crowdsourcing where the public can submit their own data on an ongoing basis. Some areas where they're different, though. One, we require we have a portion on mobile broadband data collection, which the FCC doesn't touch on, at least not in its report order. I know it asks a couple questions about it in the NPRM portion of that program. We also have a challenge process, which we thought and heard from many people was important, especially after the Mobility Fund 2 process. So those are two ways in which the two programs are similar in two ways and they're different. I will say, it's great that the FCC did use our bill as a good template, to jump off the data collection, and we think it's important that a lot of this stuff is codified in statute in addition to the FCC's rules.
Okay, did Jerry come back? Jerry, you back with us? All right. Maybe if Jerry can get reconnected, he can offer the rest of his thoughts on that question. But we'll go ahead and move on. The next question I have is for Kirk, and it's a sort of drafts off of that last question. Both pieces, Kirk, of the mapping legislation that are moving through Congress, and the first step on HR 4229 happened yesterday as it was moved out of subcommittee markup. Both pieces of legislation contain a provision that would prevent the FCC from delegating the new mapping program responsibilities to USAC. So I'm just curious how the FCC would move forward if the legislation passes and USAC isn't playing such a key pivotal role.
Well, yeah. So we, as I've mentioned, we're moving forward based on the current landscape as quickly as we can, but we are also keeping a very close eye on developments on the Hill. I can just say that we will follow the law once it's in place, and we'll need to make a number of decisions about that. But that's how we would handle it.
Okay, thank you for that. The next question is for Tim at NTIA. Can you tell us why there are some reasons why NTIA's mapping platform that you're building won't be publicly accessible? And will states have the opportunity to request confidential access to their information?
Great question. So I go back to the original legislation. So Congress directed us to update the map in coordination with the FCC and using our state partners. We're to leverage existing federal and state data sets. However, we're authorized to buy commercial data sets. So the tool right now includes a mix of public and non-public data. Some of it could be business sensitive. Some of the states actually have business sensitive data. Maybe they've collected service provider data that isn't able to be shared publicly. The UCLA data that we've purchased is we could not afford a license that would give national access to UCLA data. So you can imagine the negotiation that went into to finalizing that deal was quite interesting. But that data is available in this closed tool for our partners. So they'll have the same access we do. It's going to be a challenge we have. I've mentioned the broadband availability data. We've actually tried to acquire that data and failed twice already because we can't either afford the cost of it, or they'll have so many strings attached to it that it loses its usefulness. So these are real challenges we go through. When you think about the states, we actually already enter into data sharing agreements with them. So the 8 states that we are pilot states, we have MOUs with them, and that kind of govern the relationship and gives them access to the tool. The outreach we're doing right now for the 8 to 10 states that we're bringing on this next year, we are going through that process there. And then those states have full access to the tool. Now, the tool is closed, so the data stays in there, but what we call derivative work. So you think about, could you print off a map? Could you print off some analytics of using aggregated data? Yes. So we recognize that you can't just make a decision and say, trust me, the tool said so. We recognize that the aggregated output can be published. It's just that the tool itself is locked down because the data is encumbered.
All right, Tim, thank you for that. And I believe we have Jerry back on the line. So, Jerry, I'll let you continue your thoughts on the similarities and differences between the legislation that just moved out of subcommittee yesterday and the FCC's DODC program.
Sure. Sorry about that, everyone, and I'll try to be as brief as possible. I'm not sure when exactly I cut out there, but I think there are several important similarities. The one I think I was mentioning when I probably lost you all was the collection of shapefile data to form the basis of the FCC broadband maps versus the census block data the FCC has traditionally used in the Form 477 data. That's the data that has the one served, all served presumptions that we've been talking about for several years now, is sort of lending the strongest hand to the inaccuracies of the wireline maps today. Beyond that, I think the FCC asks a number of questions about other things it could do that the bills in the House and Senate resolve. So, for example, while the FCC asks questions about whether or not it should create a broadband serviceable location fabric to undergird and improve the granularity of the broadband maps, the bills in the House and the Senate create that broadband serviceable location fabric and answer a number of policy questions about how it ought to be created and in what time frame, and how the data should be either public or private, and how it should be kept. Beyond that, I think the bills also take a number of steps that will require other federal agencies either to use the data that the FCC creates under its program, or require those agencies to help the FCC ensure that the data that it's collecting is accurate. Those are steps, obviously, the FCC can't take as a federal agency itself, but Congress can take the federal government as a whole. Moving past the wireline differences, I also think there's a lot of differences in wireless. The FCC in its most recent broadband data item asks a number of questions about how to potentially improve its wireless data collection, its mobile data collection, but doesn't provide any answers there. As John Lynn mentioned earlier, the legislation that is moving through the House and the Senate would specify clear technical parameters about how mobile broadband providers should be submitting data to the FCC and how the FCC should be reflecting that data in maps with regard to the cell edge probability of cell service, clutter, and the cell loading factor. So I think those are all important steps where the legislation being considered by Congress goes beyond. I would also note in the House bill we authorized additional funding to help the FCC carry out some of these relevant actions. So I don't think there's any conflict, of course, between what the FCC is doing with some minor points. There isn't a large conflict between what the FCC is doing and what Congress is contemplating. I think they are complementary. I think Congress is just more specifying what next steps beyond what it has already done that the FCC needs to do.
One thing I'd like to add
Thank
too,
you, Jerry.
and if I could add one more thing, I think it's important to this group. Our bill also creates an important opportunity for state and local governments to participate in both the information collection process and the challenge process, and that's not something I think is explicitly carved out in the FCC's item.
Thank you, John, for that. And we did have a question come in from the audience. I think this is specific to Jerry's comments. Has the full ENC committee set a date for the full markup of HR 4229 now that it's moved out of subcommittee?
We have not publicly set a date, but I can imagine you'll be seeing something from us shortly, setting a date. We're moving expeditiously from subcommittee to full committee in hopes of reaching a compromise with our Senate colleagues and sending something to the president's desk shortly.
Okay, excellent. We've got another question from the audience from rural Washington State. Is the fabric going to be a proprietary data collection, meaning is the data that will inform the fabric, will that be proprietary? Or will the results be open source and available for states and even the public to access? And I guess that question is probably for Kirk, although I think both pieces of legislation in Congress also address the fabric. So the folks on the Hill might want to chime in there too. So, but I'll give it to Kirk first.
Yep. So as I mentioned, we've asked for input on what sources should go into the database, the fabric. We know that U.S. Telecom did use proprietary elements to it, and there's kind of a tension that's created because the proprietary data is often very, very useful and valuable, but it's also very expensive to license, and the more people that are able to see it, the more expensive it becomes, as Tim was referencing. So I think we would expect in what the FCC develops to also have a mix of open source databases and probably some proprietary that might restrict the full extent to which the data would be available, but we're very cognizant of the fact that we want the database to be useful to the public and all stakeholders. So we would be looking to as far as possible to use open source data sources.
So this is Jerry. I'll just chime in quickly. This is not a question that is specifically answered by our legislation. I would say that there are a number of places in the bill where we specify that the data ought to be made public. Here, I think, in consideration of the relevant balance that needs to be made between both speed and availability of proprietary data and creating the National Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric, we do provide an authorization of funds that would meet the estimate that has come out of some of the test pilots for the Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric of what it would take to have publicly available data. I think if you were to do the private source data that was used in the test pilot, I think it would cost $12 million plus the annual $1 million authorization to update the National Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric. If you were to do it on a publicly available basis in an open sourced way, I think it costs closer to $25 million in the first year, and then I think it's $8.8 million every year after that to update it. So at least in the House version of the bill, the authorization that we include keys off of that high number so that we give the FCC the flexibility to use the public source data as much as possible. I think that's what many of our members would prefer, but also understanding that there is a tension between the speed at which the broadband map could be created, the cost of the relevant data, and whether or not that data is open source or proprietary.
And Jerry, the authorization that is in HR 4229 at the amounts that you just mentioned would pay for the fabric. Is there a separate authorization or contemplation of authorization for an appropriation to pay for the rest of the program, or how do you see funding for the rest of the mapping program, in terms of data collection and processing the data and validating the data and administering the challenge process? How do you envision that being funded?
So there isn't a specific authorization with regard to the other portions of the bill. What I would also note, and it's just important for people that don't work in Washington, an authorization is just a limit on what the appropriators, so the actual check writing committees, can put into a bill. So, for example, ENC is the committee I work for is an authorizing committee. So we say $25 million and $9 million, we're giving that amount of discretion over to the appropriators to fund. And it's a signal to say, here's something important you should look at and you should think about appropriating funds there. If there is not an authorization of any kind, then the authorization under relevant precedent, legal and congressional, is that there is no limit to the appropriators. So the appropriators could, of course, come in and allocate additional money for other provisions in the bill if they wanted to. I think the underlying thought of the drafters, at least here on the House side, is the remaining provisions of the bill would likely be paid for through the FCC's ongoing programs through which it its normal operations through regulatory fees, and its annual appropriation here from Congress. One thing that is made clear through the bill is that this program, shouldn't be paid for through universal service support or other things like that by raising the contribution factor. I think that's been a concern from a number of parties.
Okay, great. I'm going to move on to a question again for Kirk. What are some of the unique challenges, Kirk, that is faced by the FCC and now potentially USAC, given its expected role in implementing the DODC, for mapping and validating broadband data in tribal lands? And does the DODC report and order address mapping and data collection in tribal lands?
Yeah, so I think probably the biggest challenge that we face is the oftentimes extreme rurality, remoteness of some of the locations on tribal lands. There are locations that don't have a fixed street address or a named street address that can make it difficult to make sure that you're accounting for all locations. The further notice makes and places an emphasis on engagement with tribal entities in terms of feedback on the DODC data filed by the providers. It contemplates a proactive approach on our part and on USEC's part, reaching out and working directly with them to make sure that we get good feedback about what's being reported and whether it in fact is consistent with what their experience is on tribal lands. We ask a lot of questions about that, and it's a real focus. And it's also they are specifically mentioned as a big aspect of what we contemplate will be the challenge process. That their input will be an important part of that.
Okay, thank you, Kirk. I have another question from the audience, again from Colorado. This is probably a question for everyone on the call. I think that there's an assumption in the person asking the question that the DODC database, once it's fully developed, or the mapping database that results from the legislation that Congress may pass, whatever ultimately the name of that will be. That information and the national broadband map that results from that data will be the basis for the dissemination of public funding, whether it's Universal Service Fund dollars, whether it's future iterations of the Reconnect program at USDA, et cetera, future grant programs that Congress may authorize down the road. It's the assumption that the national broadband map would be used as that basis for funding decisions. So the question is, how can we ensure that there are efforts to ensure transparency for information that may need to be shared with states, and also how do we ensure that where states are granting money, that the federal government is aware of those areas that are being funded, so that the funding ultimately can be maximized and not duplicated, and creating overbuild situations. So I think there are a lot of different elements to that. So I don't know who would like to take that first.
This is Kirk. I'm happy to start. Oh, sorry. So I think. Yep. For the DODC, we anticipate that the deployment data will be fully public, and as I mentioned earlier, we do understand the concerns about the timing of that and the recency of the public data. I think it's going to be a big focus for us to make it available, as quickly as we can. Same goes for the challenge data. That will be, that will be fully public. It won't be 100% fully public, but the extent of the challenge, as proposed in the further notice, will be something that will be available to everyone to see where the challenge is and what the nature of the challenge is. And as we progress with our funding programs, we would, as we have done in the past, I would anticipate that we would make public what we view, and this, I'm thinking of our next step, the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. We would make available the areas that we propose to find to be eligible for that auction. And as happened in the CAF Phase 2 auction, there was more than one iteration of that. So there was an initial publication of purportedly eligible areas, and then there was a further refinement of that as later as it got closer to the auction. And I would expect we would see something similar in connection with the RDOF.
So this is Tim from NTIA. I'll offer a couple of points. One, it kind of go back to my prior point with the FCC's map is a public-facing map, and NTIA's map is a closed map for policymakers. So we have to be careful about just using a term, the map, because there are more than one map, and they're complementary. They're not in conflict. So we'll leverage that data, and we'll bring it in to help folks make better informed decisions. One of the things that we are in the process of scoping out is exactly what this question gets to, is investment decisions. And so we want to build out capabilities within the tool to support our federal and state partners to do exactly that. And so a good scenario would be like Minnesota has a lot of eligibility data as far as their programs, and they want to overlay that with federal eligibility. One of the things from a policy perspective that we could look at is what happens when Minnesota's eligibility and a federal program's eligibility overlap. Well, currently it seems like it's a zero-sum game, and the federal program says, well, then you guys fund it. And so could we, using this data, come to a scenario where we see these overlaps? The need doesn't change depending on where the funding comes from. And so then it's more of a collaborative approach, that it's not just okay, you guys are already looking at that, so you fund it. It's a shared responsibility. And so we get to that over time, but the tool then gives us the ability through data and analytical capabilities and visualization capabilities to help pinpoint those things. And then the derivative works, while the data itself may be constrained with licensing and things like that, we can still publish things that help support why those decisions were made. And so we're certainly not there yet. We launched on September 30th, and we have 8 pilot states, and we're working through these capabilities. And one of the challenges we have in an IT cloud-based cycle is that things don't, even though we want to manage this in an agile manner from a project management perspective as far as quick iterations, when you talk about then taking those capabilities and putting them in the cloud, that requires releases and stuff like that. So we want to do a lot of this stuff quickly, but we are hampered by some of the constraints that actually make this, it's a catch-22, because the reason why we went cloud was that we had all that scalability, but it could also be a challenge for us. But that question is exactly what we're trying to do here.
Excellent, Tim. And I think sort of a related question for Jerry and John is, and I believe there are provisions in the mapping legislation that would require federal agencies to use the new national broadband map that the FCC will ultimately produce for decision-making with regard to federal funding expended for broadband build-out. Is that the case? And can you tell me a little bit more about the logic behind that requirement?
Yeah, in the Senate version, we require that the FCC consult with USDA and NTIA to reach an agreement where the agencies would use the FCC's map. Unfortunately, we're because of jurisdictional issues, we weren't able to actually make that a full-on requirement. But the idea is that we want to make sure that all agencies that are in the business of awarding broadband funding are using the same data, so that we don't have overbuilding or duplication problems. It's important that when you have such limited federal resources that are being distributed for broadband funding, that they go to the places that are truly unserved and not to overbuild. So that was the logic there, and I think that we'll find some path forward between at least the Senate version and the House version. And the House version is a little bit different.
Yeah, I think the House version specifies that the data ought to be made available, and this is actually a recent change, but must be made available to all relevant agencies for their broadband mapping and deployment initiatives. That being said, I mean, even less some full-on requirement for agencies to all consult the map. I think we have seen efforts by additional programs outside the FCC or the NTIA that fund broadband mapping to rely on the relevant data sources available. And I think assuming what is happening now continues to happen, which is the House, the Senate, the FCC, and the NTIA are all rowing in the same direction, pushing for a more accurate, granular, and timely map. I would imagine that the fruits of those labors will be utilized by the relevant agencies who do any other work in the broadband space. What I'm really thinking about is USDA here, who's the real outlier. And as far as making sure that there's adequate transparency and cohesion among the states, obviously the federal government is limited in the types of things that it's allowed to tell the states to do under the Constitution. But I do think we include in both House and Senate version relevant requirements for states to participate. We just added on the House side some language that further spells out the requirement for technical assistance with the states and others. So I think it's something that we will continue to push for to make sure that both the federal and the state governments are coordinated in this effort to map and deploy broadband, and that they can be partners in that regard, given in light of our larger federalist constitutional structure.
And on that note, Jerry, I'm sorry, did someone else have a question there or a thought?
This is Tim from NTIA. I was just going to piggyback on that again to say that our mandate is to work with our state and federal partners. So we're collaborating with them. Our goal is to help support them in their programs. And so we think that this tool, bringing all these disparate data sets together in one-stop shop, which really hasn't been done before, and are able to slice and dice data and just really answer questions for folks is going to be very helpful, kind of the missing link in this whole conversation.
Thank you, Tim. It looks like we've only got about 3 minutes left on the call, so this will be our final question. As you know, because the audience on this call is primarily state and local government, I want to open up a question to the entire panel and ask you, what are some things that you could tell states to prepare to do, maybe even shift what they're doing now to support this new federal data collection and the challenge or public feedback process that will accompany it? Specifically, are there any opinions on the call about how states should perhaps shift to playing a data validation role and providing feedback to the FCC and NTIA on the data and how it could be improved, particularly for those states that are actually running their own broadband mapping programs now? It's likely that those states need to have access to much more accurate and granular data from the federal perspective. So is there a role for states to play in validating and providing feedback to continually improve the map?
So this is Tim from NTIA. Go for it, Kirk.
Sorry, Tim. Okay, so I was just going to mention that the challenge process, as contemplated in the report and order and the further notice, envisions a significant role for states along with other stakeholders, but we do talk about the possibility of accepting bulk filings, which I think might be a way to integrate the state efforts and the products of their efforts into the challenge database. There's some issues that would need to be worked out about that, but we definitely, I mean, the item essentially sees the states as partners in this process along with others, and I think we all have the same goal, and there's a mechanism there to get there.
Yeah, and this is Tim from NTIA. Our experience so far with our 8 partner states and then the outreach we're having with other states, they're bringing a really interesting mix of data to the table here. And we find that if I'm going to provide guidance to states to look for sub-census block data, that's the most informative. The states that have grant programs and loan programs, when they're able, then they've got a carrot and they can say to a service provider, give me more data, sub-census block. That's a real good tool for those states. We found states that have done their own crowdsourcing. They've gone out and done surveys. Point data is very, very visually powerful. And so when you can actually go address street by street and talk to people and get feedback about what their broadband connectivity is and then use that as a comparative data source, that really pops. And so if states are looking to identify where they should put their money, that's a great resource. And so these broadband offices, when we connect them together, they talk to each other, and so they get to share best practices. So North Carolina, Maine, Massachusetts, these guys have all done great jobs on surveying. So if you guys in the audience here are interested in that, we can connect you to those folks and leverage those best practices. We take data as is, but if we could ever get to a point where we have some standardization on the data we get, that makes all of our lives easier and makes the product better.
Yeah, I'll just say that states are such a wealth of great data and great information about broadband availability that we think it's so important that they are a part of this process. Which is why we've carved out so many areas where they can participate, both in submitting data on the front end and in challenging and validating the data on the back end. So my message to states is please keep it up. You guys are doing a great job already, and we think that. This is a partnership here between the state and federal government, and we want to make sure that we have the best data available so that we can make sure the money gets back to you guys to serve unserved areas.
And to close it out, I would just agree with what all the prior panelists have said to say that I think the efforts here should run in tandem with the great work that has been done by the states. I think going back as far as the State Broadband Initiative and even further back than that, I think states have a track record of being able to really explore where broadband is and is not available in the way that the federal government has not always been able to do. I think, data coming out of the State Broadband Initiative was granular down to the street segment level well before there was even talk at the FCC of going below census block by census block. So I think, continuing to think through innovative ways to push the federal maps and build state maps that accurately, granularly, and in a timely way display where broadband is and isn't, and at what speeds and what latency and so on, I think is something that the states have really excelled at. And I think speaking for our members, we look forward to continuing to work in partnership to make sure that we do that and more going forward.
Well, thank you very much, Jerry, and your fellow panelists. I can't thank you enough for the robust discussion that we've had today and for the content of your presentations. This has been highly informative to me, and I hope the same is the case for the audience. So I'll turn it back over now to Kevin Moss at WGA for a few final closing remarks, and thank you again for engaging in this discussion. Kevin?
Great, thanks, Brent. And I just want to echo your appreciation to our panelists and our listeners. What I took out of this conversation, other than a lot of policy areas to think about for the governors, is just how much of a bipartisan and productive effort this is. This is a moment where a lot of agencies and committees are rowing in the same direction, and I think there's a lot of space for governors to hop in that boat as well and help get some of these efforts over the line and start mapping these rural communities a little bit better. So thank you all again. And Kirk, I also wanted to send you some appreciation for discussing the census block issue in the Form 477 process. This is a challenge that WJ has been really attentive to, just given the fact that there are so many large rural census blocks out here in the West, so that made mapping a little bit more challenging out here. So we really appreciate the FCC addressing that issue through the DODC process. And then I do want to flag for everyone that on Thursday, November 21st, we're going to be having another webinar as part of this series, and that'll be digging into specific issues with tribal communities. So we're really excited for that discussion, given the number of tribes out here in the rural West. So if you'd like to join for that, you can register on WJ's website. And then this webinar will also be posted to WJ's website later this afternoon. So feel free to share that link, and it'll go to our YouTube page. So Everyone, thank you so much for listening in, and I hope you have a great week and weekend. Thank you.
Thanks.